Great, thank you. So welcome everyone. On behalf of Highstead, Audubon Vermont, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. We have a really great program for you. My name is Katie Blake and I'm a conservationist at Highstead, a small conservation nonprofit in Reading, Connecticut. In my role at Highstead, I support the work of regional conservation partnerships, or RCPs, in their efforts to increase the pace and scale of conservation across the Northeast. I'm joined today by two co-hosts, Sarah Barker from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who directs the Cornell Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative, and by Steve Hagenbuch, Conservation Biologist and Forester at Audubon Vermont, who will be delivering the program and who I'll be turning it over to in just a few minutes. So this webinar, The Power of Birds in Driving and Sustaining Forest Management within the RCP network, is the first of 4 webinars in our series listed here. So this webinar today will explore how birds and bird habitats are effective motivators for engaging landowners in being active forest stewards. Further, this webinar will take a closer look at how the RCP network can utilize birds as ambassadors for sustainable forest management. And as a reminder, this is being recorded so that we can share it with those who weren't able to attend today, and we'll post it on our website and also share it with all the registrants after this webinar. So this event is brought to you by the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative, represented here by an incredibly diverse suite of participating partners. So this initiative is a collaborative effort between regional conservation partnerships and their partners, Audubon groups, Highstead, and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The goal of the initiative is to help RCPs connect with bird conservation in ways that advance and expand their efforts, their partnerships, and their ecological priorities. This group also aims to raise awareness and a collective knowledge about the importance of bird conservation and the role that RCPs and landowners can play in protecting and restoring habitats for declining populations. Highstead supports this initiative by serving as a co-leading organization along with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So I serve as a co-lead along with my partner and co-host today, Sarah Barker. And this initiative recently received a grant that has allowed us to put on this webinar series. And it's been specifically geared and developed toward RCP and land trust leaders in order to bring you the tools that you need for your conservation and management practices. So now I'd like to turn it over to our program host for today, Steve Hagenbuch. Steve has worked with Audubon in a variety of roles since 1998. Currently, he's a senior conservation biologist and forester with Audubon Vermont's Healthy Forests Initiative. In this position, Steve works with private landowners, municipalities, foresters, land managers, and other conservation partners to promote management activities that will enhance the health and habitat value of forest land for priority bird species. He played a key role in developing the national award-winning Foresters for the Bird program, and more recently, Bird-friendly Maple. In 2009, Steve obtained his master's degree in conservation biology from Antioch University, New England. His graduate research investigated the implications of maple sugarbush management for neotropical migrant songbirds. When not in the woods for business, Steve can still be found there, hiking, mountain biking, backcountry skiing, exploring with his kids, or whatever else seems like fun. Steve, his wife, and their 2 children live in Waterbury Center, Vermont, where they run a small family farm business. So take it away, Steve.
Great, thank you, Katie. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for being here with us today. I hope that wherever you are, you're safe and doing well and being healthy. It's a great pleasure to be able to be partnering with Highstead and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative on bringing this, what will be a 4-part webinar series on considering how managing forests with birds in mind is something that can be brought throughout the RCP network. And so this being the first in that series, It is going to be a number of these 4 webinars will kind of work in succession, but it's not necessarily important that you attend each one in order to get the full advantage of them. So they are meant to also be standalone as much as they're meant to kind of flow in a series. So a little bit later on in our presentation here this afternoon, I'm also going to be introducing to you another guest speaker, that being Annette Goyne. Annette is a private landowner who lives in Richford, Vermont, and is part of the Cold Hollow to Canada RCP, and she's going to be sharing kind of her personal story about some of the things we'll be discussing before we get to that point. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and get things started. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Thank you. Kind of a slow trend. There we go. Yeah, this was the problem that I was having, was to, computer's getting in mind of its own. Well, this is fine. We'll just leave it here for right now. So this program, looking at how birds really can help be motivators, as Katie said, and thinking about forest and forest management within the RCP network. And just real briefly before we really start talking about that, I wanted to just mention that, as Katie said, I'm with Audubon Vermont, and we are the state program of the National Audubon Society, which folks may be familiar with. Our mission quite broadly is to protect birds and the places they need today and tomorrow. And here throughout the Northeast, where I think, and Mid-Atlantic, where most of you are joining us from here, I did see that we had some folks from Maryland joining us as well, which is awesome. Thanks for being here. But really, among the most important places that birds need here within the RCP network area are our forests. As many people know, they are extremely important and cover a large part of the web of our landscape. Okay, if you advance to the next piece here. Just wanted to kind of put in everybody's minds, and these are things that you may be familiar with already, but just how much here of the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic of the landscape is in forest cover. Of course, Maine leading the way with almost 90%, and then Pennsylvania is still more than 50% of the state being in forest. So really lots of forest cover, and lots of values and attributes that those forests provide for us. Now, some of those things people are quite familiar with. If you'd advance, please, Katie. Actually, you can click it 3 times. So a lot of people who live in these regions are familiar with the recreational opportunities that they afford, the timber products that we derive from those forests, and also here, of course, our non-timber forest products like maple syrup production, which, you know, kind of unique to the Northeast US here in the upper Midwest, a product that we don't really find being produced anywhere else in the world. And so these are things that both residents and visitors to our forests alike kind of, they are aware of. They come here and many times to do these things or to see these things, how they're done. And that's really kind of commonplace for a lot of folks. The thing that most people do not realize is the next slide. Nice slow fade into this beautiful bird. Just the important role that our forests play throughout the RCP region to songbirds in particular, but birds in general, whether they be year-round resident species or migratory species like this particular gem. This is a male of a Blackburnian warbler. Our forests are really a very critical part of a bird's annual life cycle, particularly for the migratory species, for the breeding aspects. They come here with that in mind. Next slide, please. And just to illustrate that point, I love maps. Maps are great storytellers. And so this is a map that we are borrowing here that shows the results of a program called the North American Breeding Bird Survey. It's one of the longest running bird survey programs that we have, collecting using a consistent protocol to collect data on birds. The information that we're seeing here is very specific to forest nesting birds. And the key takeaway with this is to see just where in the US do we have some of the highest numbers of species, or what we might refer to as species richness of these forest nesting birds. And you can see it's that red color. These are the number of birds, the mean number of birds recorded on different survey routes in the North American Breeding Bird Survey. So the highest number being represented by the darker red color. And you can see that really the RCP region is one of the places in the country where that high species richness occurs, as well as the upper Midwest. So we do have a lot of bird species that are here, particularly in the spring and summer breeding season. Next slide, please. And a lot of that species richness is made up of birds that are referred to as neotropical migrants. Now, this is a term that some of you may have heard before, but you may or may not be familiar with. Basically, what we mean when we say a neotropical migrant is a bird species in which the majority of that species breeding population can be found north of the red line on our map, which is the Tropic of Cancer. And then the majority of that breeding of that population of that species winters south of that line. So neotropical migrants right now, and or I shouldn't say right now, because right now they're kind of in that transition phase. So we're finding that these migratory birds, our forests aren't nearly as busy with activity of birds today as they were even just a few weeks ago, because a lot of those birds are en route to that, wherever they're going, south of the Tropic of Cancer for their wintering habitat. And to illustrate that, next slide. We'll use this bird, the Scarlet tanager. This is a species that we find throughout the RCP network in our forested cover that we have. Really vibrant. If you're able to see it, it's one that you'll probably not soon forget, with that bright red color silhouetted against the blue sky behind it in the foliage of a green tree. And so they're really beautiful. We are here in the Northeast. We're kind of at the northern edge of the species breeding range. And if we look to see, though, where they winter, this bird takes quite an incredible journey to go down to South America, where it will spend the winter months, and then turn around in the spring and come right back up here again to our northeastern forests, and really everywhere east of the Mississippi River. Quite remarkably, it's not only is it the same species that's coming up here, it's the same individual that you might see in your forest here in summer will be the same individual that you'll find returning back there next spring. So absolutely incredible that they can make that journey, covering such great distances. Next slide. Now, despite the fact that we do have such a high richness of bird species, a high number of species, it's not that these birds are without threat, without dangers to things that affect their populations. And really, back in 2019, there was a really incredible study that came out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that really helped to illustrate and show just how dramatic some of the declines in bird species have been. So I selected a few things that kind of are pertinent to the region that we live in and the forest that we are a part of. So in the big picture, we have lost since 1970 almost 3 billion birds in North America alone. 2.5 billion of those 2.9 billion are migratory species. So really showing the fact that, while there are also declines in kind of the common year-round resident species, it's the migratory species that seem to really have taken the biggest toll. And then when it comes to eastern forest birds like the wood thrush that we see here in the bottom right, we've lost 6 in 10 of the wood thrush that were here in 1970, or 17% decline in eastern forest birds over that same period. So there are tremendous threats to these birds, and there certainly are. It's hard to know exactly what any one given cause might be that's causing the declines in bird species. But the one thing that's really important for us to remember is that, particularly with these migratory species, it's likely a combination of many threats from when they're here with us on the breeding grounds to throughout their migratory pathways, as well as the wintering grounds. And so we really have to think full life cycle about these species if we want to try to address the declines that they're experiencing. But the thing that we also know is that when those birds are here with us in the Northeast forest, this is the one place where they are actually able to reproduce and get that next generation of their species going. So our role in their annual life cycle is really to be that breeding habitat. If we can make sure that we provide the highest quality habitat we can, while kind of still making sure that all of our other objectives that we have for our forests are intact, that's our real conservation role with these species. Next slide, please. All right. So I wanted to just kind of go through here and have us think about what are some of the threats that our forest birds are experiencing. And I should say that when we're talking about threats to forest birds, we're really talking about threats to forests as well, because you really can't separate the two. What befalls the forest befalls the birds that are going to be nesting there. And so this was one I was going to take control of the slide advancing here, but we had a little technical difficulty right at the last second. So I'm asking Katie to do it. Katie, if you would maybe just click 5 times and we'll just put the full list up here. Let's see, one more. There we go. So these are some of the threats that we've identified that are really specific here to our northeastern forest. We're just going to walk through them right now. I want you to try to visualize these because we're going to come back to them a little bit later on, but a little bit on each one of them. So first of all, global climate change. This is something that I'm sure we're all well aware of. The current impacts, the forecasted and potential impacts of what a changing climate means to our forests also have impacts on our forest birds. National Audubon Society's science team also came out with a report a couple of years ago called Survival by Degrees, and really showed how a changing climate is going to have a dramatic change and shift to our bird populations and our bird communities. So it's definitely something that we pay a lot of close attention to, both from our bird standpoint as well as a forest standpoint. The next one being forest parcelization, fragmentation, and conversion. This is when we take large blocks of forest and we kind of break them up into smaller, often disconnected units. And we'll talk a little bit later on about why that could be detrimental to birds. Non-native and invasive pests and plants. You know, we have everything from our honeysuckle species to our Japanese barberry to our buckthorn to our multiflora rose. The list goes on and on and on of all these different plant species that now in many places have become quite common and invasive, where they are taking over and preventing native vegetation from taking hold. We also have the insects, the pests. We have the hemlock woolly adelgid, we have the emerald ash borer, spotted lanternfly is a relatively new one that has come on the scene here in the Northeast and has the potential to have some significant impacts on forests, which consequently then has significant impacts potentially on our forest birds. Nest predation and parasitism. You know, nest predation is something, it's a fact of life. Right? We have native predators out there. It's the cycle of life. And that's something that we assume and expect. But sometimes there are things where we have like house cats that get into the forest. Nest parasitism is something totally different, where we have a species of bird called the brown-headed cowbird, which isn't really a native to the eastern forest, but has moved here due to opening up the landscape in the past. And can have significant impacts on the nest productivity of our forest songbirds. Loss of insect diversity and abundance. This is something that, you know, these birds, when they're here, one of their prime diet items are insects. And if we think about even not going back that many years, when you used to be able to go to a local gas station at nighttime in the summer, and depending where you were, if it was near a body of water, there might be hordes of things like mayflies that were flying around those lights. Those are the kinds of things we don't experience them to the same degree that we did at one time. And those are all food sources that the lack of is having impacts on bird species. And the last one we talk about is reduced habitat quality. If birds don't have the attributes in the forest that they need in order to find suitable nest sites and to forage for food, their ability to be able to nest successfully is going to be diminished. Next slide. But now we're going to try to bring it back up again. So we had this great opportunity beginning about, thinking about the great role that our forests play to bird conservation. We're kind of an important part of these birds' annual life cycle. And we heard about some of the downsides to where those birds are going. But the bright side is where we're going to focus on now, and that is the opportunity that exists. The opportunity is, and particularly with the RCP network, is to mobilize this network of landowners, land managers, and other natural resource professionals and their partners to promote healthy forests. And there's lots of things to our advantage. There's lots of benefits, things that we know about our landowners, about people who live here in the Northeast that can help make this a reality. Next slide. So if you're not familiar with the National Woodland Owner Survey and the tools for engaging landowners effectively, or also known as TELI, these are some resources that would be great for everyone to kind of check out, because they've done a great job of looking at the landowner base and kind of the reasons that people have land, the reasons they do what they do, And these are all tools that we can use as people that are looking to create change on the land, to help make sure that we're being effective in the programs that we have. So why can birds be such a great motivator for people to think about managing the forest in ways that promote a healthy forested landscape? Well, on the the left side here, one of the first things we'll see, and this is data specific for New England, the reasons why people own woodlands. This would be private landowners. If we had done this survey 15, 20 years ago, I think the list would have been in different order. But given where we are today, just the beauty of owning land is one thing that people are really interested in. And number two is they want to have wildlife. That's kind of a broad term, but people are very interested in wildlife. So we've already captured this base of people that want to do things that are good for wildlife. We can see that by the graph on the right. This is a graph that shows, now I will say we've switched now from New England on the left. This is a national data set here, that when it comes to the types of activities people seek out information on, that's what we're seeing here. So how to manage for timber leads the way in what people are looking at, which I find interesting. When you look on the graph on the left, people say that their reasons for owning woodland timber ranks very low. But when they go looking for information, it kind of comes back up towards the top of the list. But right behind that, again, is wildlife. So we have two things going for us. One, we have people who own their land because, in part, because they're interested in having healthy wildlife populations. And number two, they are looking for information on how they can manage that land for wildlife. So right off the bat, we've got a great scenario to work with. Next slide. Further along that line, we can see what people have done on their land in terms of stewardship activities and what they plan to do. Graph on the left shows in the past what landowners have indicated they have done on their property. And you can see that when it comes to the number of acres that people have done work on, it's doing something for wildlife that leads the way. And when you look at what people plan to do in the future on the right, once again, wildlife leads the way. So again, positioning us very well to be able to reach people with the messaging about how birds and other wildlife can be key motivators. Next slide. And finally, just coming around back more to the birder end of things, this is some data from the US Fish and Wildlife Service that looked at the percentage of people in different regions of the US that considered themselves to be birders. And this is where actively going out and doing birding. The Middle Atlantic states leads the country. 25% of the people surveyed said, of the population in those areas, said that they were birders, and then followed right behind by 20% here in New England. So with the US average being 18, the Mid-Atlantic and New England states together, really we are above average when it comes to people that are interested in birds specifically. So we start matching all of this data together, we can see that birds are really that good hook. Not only to engage in land, but we know from the loss of our species, it's also an important thing to do for bird conservation. Next slide. So just to state it again, the opportunity is that people love birds. It doesn't matter if you know what the species is that you're looking at. It doesn't matter if you can identify the sound that you're hearing. Just getting out there, birds are easy to see. They are easy to hear, despite, again, maybe not knowing what they are. And so they're very accessible. They're a way for people to connect to the land and who also see changes in their populations. When we change the landscape, birds often respond relatively quickly to the changes that we make. And so they're just a great way to get people thinking about the land and things that they can do to enhance a healthy landscape, in this case, forests. Next slide. Okay. So birds have really been important to us beyond just observing them and enjoying the beauty of their colors, their breeding plumage, or the songs they sing. They've been important for other reasons as well. Kind of cliche, but the canary in the coal mine certainly is relevant to that discussion. Birds indicated a very unhealthy environment in the mines, or a healthy environment based on how well that they did. And that same trend can even continue today. Now, not in the mines necessarily, but in our forests. Next slide. I think the computers have not had their coffee today. Is everybody else seeing a slow delay, or is it only me? Okay. All right. So birds, their presence of certain species indicates certain things. They tell us certain things about the forest that we're in. On the left side, we have birds like the yellow-bellied sapsucker in the upper left, and the scarlet tanager in the upper right, the black-throated blue warbler in the lower right. These are all bird species that if we hear them, if we see them, they are indicators of what we might describe as a mature forest habitat. So it's a certain condition that supports a certain suite of bird species. And so their presence indicates that to us. On the other side of the coin, we have birds that are indicators of young forest, like the chestnut-sided warbler in the upper left, the American woodcock young, which you may or may not be able to see in the bottom right. They're very cryptically colored and kind of camouflaged in there, but they're there. And then we also have the veery from top right going diagonal, the veery, Canada warbler, and white-throated sparrow. So individual species indicate certain conditions that we find in our forest, which is very helpful for moving us forward. Next slide. Birds are also ambassadors for us, as kind of alluded to in the title of the presentation. When we start to understand that certain birds, like the bird we see here, which is a black-throated blue warbler, really requires, for high quality habitat, a good dense understory of vegetation in a mature forest. So seedlings and saplings and shrubs of native species that we find in our forest is really the exclusive place where this bird species is going to be nesting, and also where it spends the majority of its time foraging for insects. So when we get out on the land with landowners and other people, and we can show them the importance of having this low dense cover in the forest, it helps people to be able to think about, boy, how could I do things in stewarding my land that might enhance that feature, help make it available so that a black-throated blue warbler can find the nesting habitat that it needs. Next slide. So I'm going to go back again to, and Katie, go ahead and just click through. These are we're going to see the same list of threats again. One more right there. Okay, thank you. So birds as ambassadors, once again. We're going to go back through each one of these and think about how birds can help us, inspire us to think about addressing the threats that they're facing. So global climate change, I just mentioned that before, the report that was put out by National Audubon Science Team on the impacts of climate change. We know, and through work with our partners that really spend their time thinking about climate change and climate mitigation and adaptation and carbon storage and sequestration, that the same practices that we may use for enhancing bird habitat are pretty much exclusively the same practices that are used for climate adaptation and mitigation. So if we are managing forests with birds in mind, if that's something that is important to people who own the land, at the same time, we are inherently helping to manage that forest in ways that will make it more adaptable to a changing climate, and helping in the storage, being a natural climate solution in storing carbon and sequestering more carbon. In the forest parcelization, fragmentation, conversion, birds that require that mature forest actually do not do quite as well in smaller forest fragments. So take the scarlet tanager that we've met a few times. It is more likely to be successful and achieve higher abundance in forest blocks that are a couple hundred acres in size or larger. In smaller forest blocks, we may find it, but its nest productivity may be lower, and the actual nest success overall, and the number of birds we find there, is likely to be lower as well. At the same time, if we are managing our forest resource in certain ways that is able to produce a forest product that might help to offset the cost of owning that land, then it makes it less likely that we're going to feel the need to sell that land off in order to not have that expense once more. It's not an absolute. You can be guaranteed that you're going to be able to sell forest products and cover all the costs of owning land, but it certainly can help in doing compared to doing nothing. Non-native invasive pests and plants. Again, birds will eat a lot of insects, but they also, before they migrate here, they tend to need a lot of fruit. And when those plants that are available that provide fruit are the non-native ones, There's good research to show that some of those species just do not have the same nutritional quality for these birds as native plants do. So if birds are feeding up and fueling up and fattening up, that's what they're actually eating those berries for, is to fatten for migration. If they're leaving here having fueled up on non-native species, the fruit of those plants, they're leaving here in lowered fitness. So it really is important for us to think about what we can do to mitigate the abundance of those non-native invasive plants on the landscape. Nest predation and parasitism will kind of, managing the forest can help with that. Particularly if we think about our road networks that we put in for forest management activities. Smaller, narrower roads, don't make them any bigger than they need, can help to reduce predators getting in there, and certainly the nest parasites as well. The loss of insect diversity and abundance pretty much matches up very well with the non-native and invasive plants. Non-native plants do host a lower diversity of insects than native plants. So we want to make sure that we have as many native species on the land as we can, so those insects can be abundant. And reduced habitat quality, it kind of goes back to the idea that a managed forest that helps to create what we call structure, lots of good low vegetation for that black-footed blue warbler. You see in the photo here, we have a standing dead tree in the background there, so maintaining those standing snags, understanding what birds need, and that will be part of the next webinar that we do, kind of the habitat requirements of these birds, helps us to think about things we may do on our own land to enhance those qualities and make that habitat quality greater. Next slide. So one of the things that we really have been trying to do as of late, it's great when landowners are willing to do some of these things, to steward their land in ways that benefit birds just for the sake of doing it. But we also know that there's a need to reach out to people that may be more of a non-traditional partner, those who may not think of bird conservation as something that they are a part of, or don't see that it's relevant to them. So at Audubon Vermont, a number of years back, we started a program called the Bird-friendly Maple Program. The idea here is that we are encouraging maple syrup producers to add bird habitat to the objectives for managing their forest land or their sugar bush that they manage for syrup production. And in doing so, we actually give them a little bit of a market advantage. We give them unique marketing materials, like the labels that they can put on their containers. You can see the sign we have here. This guy actually would already be doing things good for birds. This is John Buck, who is recently retired from the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. But not all maple producers are thinking about birds when they're out there. So by helping them to understand that a healthy sugar bush for producing maple syrup can also align very well with healthy bird habitat, and they can see that they might have a market advantage in doing so, they're more likely to initiate in those behaviors. So we think of this as something called market-based conservation. And now other states throughout the Northeast are looking to, I know Mass Audubon is doing something in New York. Audubon New York is working with partners over there to bring this to bear. And I'm also going to be working with Maine and Maine Audubon to bring up a similar program there. So lots of interest in this kind of thing. Next slide. And also along the lines of this market-based conservation, we have been involved here in Vermont on a pilot program for a couple of years now. We're just kind of testing the waters and see how well it works. But it's with International Paper, and in particular their mill in Ticonderoga, New York. And so the idea here is that IP Ticonderoga has a procurement preference, which means that they will preferentially buy wood from properties that are being managed with birds in mind. So properties where they've engaged with their forester to really think about bird habitat, or they've even engaged with Audubon to come out and help them think in those terms. IP is giving a preferential purchasing to those individuals. And we've seen a couple of cases where that has really been an important motivator for the financial benefits when the markets were a little tight and there wasn't a lot of need for this low grade wood or pulpwood. A landowner could know that they'd be able to sell their products if they were thinking about birds intentionally in the management of their forest land. So I'm really excited about this potential for expansion, see how we can help evolve this and make sure that it's a win-win-win all the way around for everyone. So with that in mind, we're going to switch gears a little bit here now. It's one thing to hear from me to kind of share as a practitioner, a professional in this field, the things that we think about, the things that we try to get other people to think about. It's another thing to hear directly from someone who's doing it. So I'm going to introduce here Annette Goyne. Again, she'll introduce herself a little bit. And I want to thank her in particular because she's actually, she's a teacher librarian at a middle high school here in Vermont. So she's actually in school right now, but she's taking the time out to join us and share kind of her experience and how birds have been kind of a key motivator, birds and wildlife in general, key motivator in the stewardship of the property that her and her husband, Jeff, have been managing. So with that, Annette, I'm going to turn it over to you. And maybe Katie, if you want to advance to the next slide.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, so if you want to go to the next slide, actually, Katie, that would be great. So just a little bit of background. My husband, Jeff, and I bought our land probably about 40 years ago, and we've lived on it for about 36 years. It was the largest part of a farm. So the largest parcel of a farm that was subdivided. So we wanted to raise horse and sheep, but we also loved wildlife. And so the parcel had a lot of the ingredients that we wanted at the time. It had woods, it had a nice couple of brooks. And it also had some open pasture land for our horses and sheep. But it has changed over the years. We no longer have horses and sheep. We got a little bit too much work about probably 15 to 18 years ago. So some of the open land has grown up, but we've actively managed with birds in mind for, I'd say, the last 10 years about. But I've always been a birder, so I've always been interested in them and looking for them and thinking about what things I can plant or how I can manage on my own. So we've been in the Vermont's current use plan a couple of times. We're currently in it. And so we've worked with foresters. And when we started our last plan, our forester, Charlie Hancock, and Nancy Patch, our county forester, both suggested a patch cut on our land to enhance wildlife. So it wasn't just for birds, it was for deer to have that early browse and snowshoe hare and other species in addition to birds. But when I heard it would really increase some primary habitat for certain types of birds, my ears perked up. And Steve had done some work with Nancy on promoting these key species. So I learned a bit about that. We are also in Cold Hollow to Canada's woodlot program. So Steve came and spoke to that. So as a landowner, it's been sort of a progression of learning from experts about what you can do to manage your land for birds. So as you can see on the map on the left is a zoom out, which is sort of the Google topographical map. So you can see the actual wooded area in addition to my land. And then on the right, Steve made this wonderful map with the yellow outline of our property. So where our house sits is where the Google Maps is. So we have a long 1/4 mile driveway, and it goes through willows at the bottom. It's kind of wet down at the bottom there, a lot of scrub, a lot of willows and alders. And then the darker area on the bottom side of the driveway is balsam trees that we planted, thinking we wanted to have Christmas trees. And of course, we planted way too many and they got ahead of us, which is fine because now we have this great habitat for certain types of birds with those balsam trees there. And then if you look up a little further to the, well, with the map, it looks like it's further to the right. You'll see the patch cut. So, it's directly below the field in front of our house, sort of towards the bottom of the map there. And so you can see that that's got a lot more openings in it than the surrounding forest. So our property is 39% mature forest and 13% young forest or early successional. And then we still have the open fields as well, which to my delight, every spring our woodcock uses. We have a couple woodcocks definitely by the house and then down below in the field that my neighbors have as well by that willow alder area. So by happenstance, I mean, I think we kind of did the checklist when we viewed the property when we bought it, that it has brooks, it's got woods, we want to heat with wood, it's got fields for our horses and sheep, it's got all these different elements. But with birds in mind, I just love our property because it has so many different habitats, and some has grown up a little, the fields, but it's encouraged that early successional habitat for certain types of birds. So I feel very blessed that I have a property where I can just take a walk and see different types of birds and different types of habitat. So you can go to the next slide. But I'm just one little landowner, and I belong to this woodlots program. And so that has allowed me to think in terms of the bigger picture. So what my neighbors do is equally important to the birds. Don't see any property lines. So on the left-hand side, you can see a very zoomed out picture of, I'm over on the left-hand side, the little red dot. But behind me, you go all the way up to J, and you'll see that it's mostly really dense, mature forest, which is great. But there's very little openings there at all. So my little patch cut is really helping those species of birds. You can see that on the right as well, just a bigger picture. There are some wetlands on the other side of my property, further south and west. So those are great because I often see Canada geese or great blue herons flying over. There's also a pond. I'm joined today actually with two of my students who are my neighbors, one directly in back of me and one across the mountain, and his grandparents belong to the woodlot program. So there is a pond near my neighbor's house as well. So there is a little bit of wetland, even though it's not on my property, but I do have the brook, so I have that too. So anyway, this slide is just to show you that whatever I do is a little piece of a much bigger puzzle. So I'm trying to do well by the birds, but I'm thinking it's great to know my neighbors and think about what they're doing as well, or offer my, just whatever, just to have time with them through the woodlots program. We do that. We take time to walk each other's woods and see what each other is doing. Next slide, please. So this is to show you the land in back of our woods, which is mature forest. We've been working on opening that up. My husband is doing all the work for that, I might add, that he's the one with the chainsaw. But we heat by wood, so he has taken out a lot of wood over the years from our woods, but he is definitely trying to open it up right now to release mass trees. So on the right-hand side is his first yellow birch that he released. And yellow birches are just a haven for their seeds for all kinds of birds. Our red poles that we had in abundance last winter would just feast on those trees, and the gray birches. So it has traditionally, one area of it has had very little understory. So for, species like the black-throated blue warbler, we've been trying to increase that. So when you open up a tree for a mast, you also encourage more sunlight, so you'll get that structure in the understory. So we're working on that. So if you can zoom to the next slide. Yeah, so that's the crown of the yellow birch right there. So there's a lot of sky. And then that has encouraged species like the black-throated blue warbler that Steve mentioned. So they need a lot of good understory. And I'm happy to say that I've had one all summer, a couple that have been nesting where we've created more understory. So next slide, please. So this is just a bird that I saw this last weekend. So it's a Bart Owl that my husband came in and was like, there's a Bart Owl out back. And my first reaction was to not disturb it. But of course I did want to see it. So I did get a great shot of it. We've had Bart Owls nesting in our mature woods. So that's just part of the joy is, it's a thrill when you see them up close and personal. I find owl pellets back there. So it's just fun. So that's the joy for you when you manage your land for birds. So next slide, please. And that's the black-throated blue warbler. that we were talking about. So next slide. And the ovenbird is there all summer long. So they are a deep woods bird, but I've been reading a book right now on migration, and found out that, well, ovenbirds and the deep woods thrushes, they need early successional for their nestlings. It's a lot safer in early young woods for them because there's a lot of scrub. So they're hidden from predators, and there's a lot of insects there because of all the shrubs, and a lot of fruit as well. So I just saw an ovenbird a couple days ago, actually. I've been seeing it in our patch cut. So I'm pointing this out because you need mature woods for ovenbirds, but it's really nice to have that early successional nearby for them to move their fledglings to, and for them to bulk up for migration as well. Next slide, please. So this is, I'm taking you on a walk through our land. This is entering the patch cut. So you can see there's a lot of open area there, a lot more sunlight. It actually looked like a bomb had dropped when my husband finished his job on the patch cut. There were trees down everywhere, tops. He did it all himself with a chainsaw, so no big equipment. And so that was intentional. All that debris on the ground creates great habitat for all kinds of critters, not just birds, but lots of nesting spaces, and also encourages dead wood for the woodpeckers and species that need the larvae from dead wood. Next slide, please. So we're walking through it. There's a picture of my husband. The paths that you try to create in May are disappearing very fast by July. So it's really there for the birds and animals. It's hard to get through. So there are a lot of brambles now because of all that sunlight. And next slide, please. I think I have a picture of a mature mountain ash coming up. So there again, just to show you that it's a lot of early goldenrod, brambles, and early saplings now that are coming up. Next slide, please. So that area is now home to chestnut-sided warblers, which really need this habitat throughout the summer. Next slide. And a lot of white-throated sparrows as well. So both these species, in addition to others, really need this early successional growth in order to create new birds during the spring and summer. Next slide, please. Yeah, so it did look like a bomb. There's lots of logs still lying around. You'll trip over them because it's so brushy and you don't see them as you're walking. It's great in wintertime when I can snowshoe on top of them. But all these logs look really messy, but those logs are great for partridge. Ruffed grouse, they will use those for drumming. So it's really important for certain species. And also pileated woodpeckers, I have a lot of hairy woodpeckers, downy woodpeckers. They're all going to use that. And also for the insect cycle as well, so as it decomposes. So anyway, messy is good is my point. Next slide, please. So there's the partridge drumming. So always fun to hear. It sounds like a motor starting up in the woods. Next slide. And there's, in that patch cut, we have some really mature now mountain ash that of course my husband would have left for the fruit. And we have flocks of robins on their migration coming to that, eagerly awaiting the berries. So I see that annually, that migrating flocks definitely will feast on those berries, cedar waxwings as well. And we have a lot of hawthorn young bushes coming in as well. And so that is fruit for all kinds of birds, and also the northern shrike will like that. They use the thorns to impale their prey. So at any rate, it's a very valuable So this is the northern shrike, and then the robins eating the mountain ash, and the flicker as well up there. So just some eye candy for you. Next slide. Yeah, and so we also have a lot of chickadees whenever I go through the patch cut or my mature woods. We have local native species that are there all the time. We also put up in our woods some roosting boxes for the winter for our local resident birds to keep warm. And you can see that at the base of that tree. And that one, I took that shot before it got put back up. Our bear came through this spring and used that to scratch on. So it was down. But you can provide some things like that in your woods as well to help the birds through the winter, stay warm on those 40 below nights. Next slide, please. So this is, my husband was told by our forester that he should girdle some poplar trees to slowly kill them, basically, to provide some snags for certain bird species. The woodpeckers would benefit from them as they decay, but also these snags, I see lots of ravens using them to roost on, and hawks for sure. So they're important to leave as well. Next slide, please. So this is just our snowmobile trail that goes through our land. So that is a nice area because not only do the snowmobilers benefit, but the birds do as well, because it's a little bit of an edge area and open. There are species like the red scarts that will sally out for birds from mature trees alongside the trail. And then as you walk further down the snowmobile trail, you'll go through our fields, and then there are a lot of willow trees. I have alder flycatchers there, the chestnut-sided warblers, definitely species that like open and wet and early successional there. Next slide, please. And that's then coming back up the loop, up our driveway. Again, just more shots of early successional and the willows there that are, every time I go past there, I'll go there this evening and there will be birds there. So next slide, please. Yeah, and then another just happy happenstance on our land. My husband and I planted a lot of acorns about 30 years ago, and they are mature and producing their own acorns now for the last 10 years or so. So oaks are great because they have all kinds of insects that feed on them, in addition to the acorns, for blue jays and squirrels and chipmunks. But there's an awful lot of insects that all the neotropical migrants birds will use. So oak trees are a super great tree to have on your land to feed the songbirds during the summer. Next slide, please. And so then this is our Christmas tree stand, which is very shady now. And I just walked in there the other day and I was sort of mobbed by about 12 chickadees and 2 red-breasted nuthatches. So they were all checking me out like, who is this person? But they were all feeding on the tops of the balsams, have all kinds of pine cones and seeds right now. So they're hiding them for the winter, storing them, eating them right now too as well, but they're really busy with those. So that was just something that we didn't plan, but a nice stand of balsam is super great for some of these birds as well. Next slide, please. And also kinglets I see in that balsam area very often, both ruby crown and golden crown. Next slide, and we're almost there. Yeah, so another thing I just want to end with pointing out, leaving it messy is great. On the left, you have a picture of an anthill in our patch cut, and that is great for the flickers. They will eat the ants, but also I've seen them scratched by bear. So all these things, it might look messy to you as a landowner, but it's great for wildlife. And so just leave it alone. It'll benefit one of the species on your land. So, and then my last slide is just to further demonstrate that point. Just whatever you do for birds, it's going to be good for the deer. It's going to be good for, you know, the bugs, which feed the insects, which feed the birds, and then mammals as well. And then, yeah, so it's just a cycle of what Steve was saying, what affects the birds affects the forest. So I feel like we originally wanted our land because we loved wildlife. I was the birder. My husband was not the birder. He really loves to see animals, and he's a real tree person. He was a nursery manager. So my daughters grew up knowing their forest trees. So he was really into the trees. And now he's a birder. So he's learned to appreciate that if we maintain our forests for birds, it's going to benefit all the wildlife that he has wanted to see all along. So yeah, I'm just very fortunate to have learned a lot from experts like Steve and Cold Hollow to Canada, and just Bridget Butler, another mentor. So just learning, I think, on your own about birds. There are a lot of books available, but seek out people like Steve who can walk your land with you and make recommendations for what you could do on your land to improve your habitats for birds. So.
Great. Thank you very much. That's outstanding. And I really appreciate the kind of the walk around the land to see, the different things you've done. And I'm glad you mentioned the point about Jeff, as you had shared with me the other day, kind of how this whole experience has really taken him, who really had not been very interested. I mean, I'm sure he was interested, but he wasn't a birder per se. And this journey that you've been on in managing your forest, kind of through that lens of wildlife, habitat in general, and now birds more particularly, really helped him to, you can't help but not, right, become a birder. So that's really great to hear. And I'll say to everyone, Annette's story is unique in its own right to her and her family, but it's not a unique story from if you are around and you start talking with people. And a lot of people do what they do, as we saw in some of the data that was presented earlier in the presentation. They do what they do for wildlife. And although they may be, if they're in certain tax programs in your state, like here in Vermont, the use value appraisal current use, which encourages management, you may not be doing it for the sake of timber management, but you can be doing it when you start to understand the values to wildlife in general, birds in particular. It really helps to understand that there's a much bigger benefit to doing that kind of work. So again, it's the power of birds. They really do capture people's imaginations and help them to inspire action on the ground. And as we continue to go through, maybe advance to the next slide, if you would, Katie. As we look to the next webinar series, so they will be happening again here on September 22nd. So next Wednesday, the 29th, the week after that. And we're going to take a week off and then come back on October 13th. So they're all Wednesdays at the same time. Next week's webinar is going to really be around the habitat requirements of some of these birds that we've been hearing about today. And we'll hear a perspective of how from Dan Kilborn, who's a forester with the Vermont Land Trust. And we'll be looking at a particular property the Vermont Land Trust owns and how Dan has been incorporating bird-specific habitat considerations into the management plan, which then filters into the active management that occurs on the ground. So we'll hear kind of that case study of how he's done that there next week. So we hope that you will join us for that. We're going to kind of just wrap things up here on the formal end of things, and then we're going to stay on. For anybody who needs to leave, feel free to do so at that point. But we'll stick around to, I know we have some questions, and we'll make sure that we address those and get everybody taken care of before we say goodbye for the day. So if people have, as you see here, questions specific to forestry with birds in mind, foresters for the birds, anything forests and birds, you can direct those to me, and I can help to connect you with people in your area that may be able to help you with that. And our fourth webinar will be focused specifically on resources in different states within the RCP network on that. And then if you're interested in getting more information about the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative or the work that Highstead's doing, you can reach either Katie or Sarah, and their email addresses are there. So I think that wraps up the screen sharing part. So we can go ahead and jump off that and go ahead and take a look at some of the questions. But thank you, Annette, again, very much for being here with us. if you are able to, stick around in case we have some questions specifically for you.
Yes, I can.
So let me see if I can find Katie or Sarah. Oh, here we go. I'm looking at the questions.
Steve, you have the first
Yep.
question you have is from Brian Hall. How does Audubon go about deciding which bird species they would like to favor and disfavor when coming up with a management plan?
Great. It's an excellent question, Brian. It's one that comes up almost all the time. Thinking about who, because you manage for the what's good for the goose isn't good for the gander, as the old saying goes. And that's true. When you manage for one species of bird, you may be managing against another species. So we tend to think more about, rather than taking a species approach, we try to think about these guilds or groups of species. So for example, kind of its most simplistic level, we might think about, is it most important to manage for more of those mature forest birds? So might manage for structural complexity in a mature forest, or would it be more desirable to try to create some of that young forest or early successional habitat? So one of the things we do, and Annette mentioned this, which is great, we take this landscape level view of a given property to really try to discern what other land cover types are out there, how much young forest might there be, if there's any at all, how much wetland is there, things of that nature. So we use a landscape that's 2,500 acres, and that's based out of just how some of the other bird literature, looking at managing specifically for things like scarlet tanager and the forest thrushes, have always kind of used that approach. So we use a similar approach. Here in Vermont, Audubon uses a target of how much young forest would we want to see in a landscape. And we base that off of the natural disturbance regimes that our main forest type, that being northern hardwoods, typically go under. So those events are things like a single tree comes down in a wind event, or 3 trees come down in an ice storm. The things that create kind of the larger patches, so to get that young forest or early successional habitat, actually this is going to relate to Kathy's question a little bit later on about the size of these patch cuts. Patch cuts is an interesting term because it can be used to describe different things. So let's use it in the terms of creating early successional or young forest habitat. At a minimum, those patch cuts need to be 1 acre in size. Ideally, they're more than that. So let's almost go with 1.5 acres to 2 acres at a minimum. If we're really trying to encourage birds like the chestnut-sided warbler and the white-throated sparrow to be on our property, we're going to want a group, a gap, a patch that we've opened up, taken the canopy away over that much of an acreage. So in that landscape of 2,500 acres, we're trying to achieve somewhere between 3 to 5% of that landscape at any given time in that young forest condition, which means patches of 2 acres or more in size. So that's kind of how we determine what habitat condition to create. It's less about what bird we're creating a condition and then thinking about the birds that will respond to it. So we're thinking about the guild or the group of birds rather than individual species that might be there. So, using even Google Earth, or if you're a GIS person, you have access to that aerial imagery to kind of get an idea of what's in your area, what's missing, and then focus on creating or what's missing or enhancing what's there to achieve that outcome. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
Great. So Steve, there's a question from John Hankins. He said, I'm a part of a land trust that owns dozens of properties with a variety of characteristics. What are the characteristics of a property that would be a good candidate for actively managing for bird habitat?
Anything, right? Honestly, any property has the potential to be good bird habitat for different species. On a forest perspective, sometimes a smaller property makes it difficult to manage. If you're thinking about kind of commercial harvesting, something that helps pay the cost of getting that work done, it's a little hard to do if it's only a 5 or 10 acre property. So that might be a consideration, but you can enhance, even if it's creating, as Annette mentioned, creating those standing dead trees or snags by girdling would be the practice, as long as it's in a safe place that's not going to fall down and hurt other people that might be out there. Removing invasives can be done on a very small property, but so, you know, birds, and I think Annette mentioned this too, they're not seeing the corner pins. They're not seeing the artificial boundary that's on the map showing the boundary lines. They're using the land. And so they don't know if your property is small or big. They just see the land. So if you're doing something on a small property, it can have big benefits to a bird. So I would say, it's not intended to be an easy way out, but any property is good. There's always something you can do to enhance its value for bird species. It might just be, what are those bird species going to be? They might be generalists like song sparrows, which is fine.
I could add a little to that, Steve. It's
Yeah.
not really part of our forests per se, but I have, a hammock in my yard, which is right near, it's underneath a maple and an oak. And right on the other side is my vegetable garden. And so we've got elderberry bushes near there. And then, so an open area. And I see more bird species using the oak above me and the elderberry bushes, and just a grapevine that we planted that has traveled up the maple tree. Oh, there's a balsam there as well. So there's a lot of cover. And I would say that whole area that where I see all the birds is about 20 feet, well, with the crowns and everything, but where I see them, like within, maybe a 30 square foot area. So you can create this mini habitat just in your backyard if you think about layers and structure, and some fruiting bushes or vines.
Great. Thanks, Annette.
So Steve, Kathy had another question. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go. I was going to kind of follow up on Kathy's question there. So, back to the size of the patch cuts again. So if I'm thinking about, if I've got this mature forest, a high canopy, the forest that's behind me here in my photo, mature forest. If I want to enhance the structure and get good understory growth for black-throated blue warbler and wood thrush, the size of a patch or a group or a gap, however you want to describe it, is going to be smaller. It might be a 1/10 acre, it might be a 1/4 acre, or it could even be up to a 1/2 acre in size, and it's still going to retain that mature forest bird community. So we're not switching it over to the early successional habitat. It's only when those openings get bigger. Again, that acre or more seems to be a threshold where once you do an acre opening patch, the birds that come in there are going to start to be more of those young forest nesting birds. You might still get a black-throated blue on the edge, but so it's kind of, it depends on what your objective is and what kind of habitat you're trying to enhance or create. The fern question is certainly a big one. What we have found here, certainly in Vermont, is that two things seem to really exacerbate fern growth in any gaps that we create. One is an abundant deer population, so that the seedlings of trees, which may have a chance, now it depends what the ferns are. You're mentioning bracken fern. I don't know if they're the same as hay-scented fern and being allelopathic, where they send out chemicals that kind of inhibit regeneration of trees. But if you have high deer pressure, that certainly can be one issue that exacerbates the fern problem. The other one is the size of the openings. Smaller openings tend to, it seems, be filling in more with the fern than the bigger openings that are getting a lot more sunlight in them. But I don't think we've really come up with a solution, and site condition too, just the soil types. Certain soils seem to do better at having trees come in quickly, and whereas other ones, maybe poor quality soils, do not. So I don't have an answer for how to prevent that from happening.
And so Annette, there is Christine Parrish has a question here for you. She said, your slides would be great to use with the landowners I work with to do habitat improvement in Maine. And she was wondering, Christine, feel free to speak up if you like, if you're still on, but she was wondering if she could have access to your slides.
Yes, that would be fine. Maybe the best is if you put your email in the chat and I copy it and send it to you. Yeah, I think and all the pictures of birds there, just to let everybody know that I got a lot of those from Creative Commons. So I'm a librarian. I wanted to acknowledge that I did not take most of those. I think the Bart Owl is the only one that I took. So I tried to give credit to the people who created those. So yeah, you're more than welcome to have those.
Great. So it looks like those are all of our questions right now in the chat, but please feel free to unmute and ask Steve or Annette a question if you have one.
Quiet group. I'll just mention, I saw, just looking at some of the names that are up here, I see, I hope it's okay, I mentioned this, Bruce Cushing, just kind of give a shout out to Bruce. Bruce owns land in New York State, and I know has been working with Audubon New York on the same kind of thing, really thinking about bird habitat and how to enhance that, how to manage that forest with birds is kind of a lens in which to view it. So good to see you here, Bruce.
Yeah. Hey, good to see you. You've done a nice job. And it's hard to learn to leave things messy.
It is. It is. But you know the importance of it.
I was really shocked when my husband had been working for a few weeks and I'm busy at school. And then the first time I went in the pasture, I was like, oh my gosh, what have we done? It was like really like a bomb had hit. So I can appreciate it intellectually, but when you see it, it's like, oh my goodness. So, but it's great. It's not for you, it's for the wildlife, really. So, but that said, it is a joy to walk through there. You know, and we have a tick issue now in Vermont, and so you know, you just have to dress appropriately and as you brush by everything, and check yourself later, so you can still enjoy it. It's fine.
Great. All right. Looks like that's it for today. So again, thank you all for being here, and hopefully we'll see you a week from today. Same time, same channel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.